Thank you for auditing the Always Positive new music review show hosted by a French professor who's been on Thanksgiving break, which has meant I haven't been listening to music. I've just been watching movies. If you go over on my spam channel, I talk about Ghostbusters and House of Gucci, and later today I'll be talking about Spencer. You may want to check that one out because I have a lot of interesting points about Radiohead. So, it's Thanksgiving break, so I've been hanging around a lot with my family. I've been seeing movies. Now, it's very cold, it's snowing right now. You may hear the sound of the heater. Please tell me in the comments if that buzz is super annoying. I just don't want my family to get cold. Maybe you won't say anything then. But I have watched over the last 3 days the 9 hours of the Get Back documentary by Peter Jackson on Disney+. And I'm going to do a kind of a review. Sort of partly a review and partly just a discussion of the things that I saw, things that I didn't know. I am a fairly big Beatles fan. I used to think, like when I was in high school, I thought I knew everything about the Beatles. I was like the world expert on the Beatles. Looking back at it, I knew basically nothing. The question is this about Get Back, and you'll see this in the thumbnail already. Is Get Back a good Beatles documentary or a bad Peter Jackson movie? Let me tell you, I like Peter Jackson. I like Lord of the Rings. I like the Lord of the Rings trilogy. I like them slightly less than the next guy. And I think the parallels are pretty clear here. A group of lovable, young white guys with funny accents arriving at a sort of difficult destination, trying to get out of their own way, ending in triumph. But my issue with Lord of the Rings movies is really just the editing. The fact that The Return of the King won an Oscar for Best Editing, in my opinion, is the worst Oscar ever given. I thought it was a mess. I thought it was too long. It was too self-indulgent. It was too in love with itself. And so is this what's going to happen? If you give Peter Jackson 60 hours of unedited behind-the-scenes footage, I half expected him to come out with an 80-hour movie. In some ways, he's the worst person in the world to be given all of this information because he has shown time and time again, he's very brilliant, he's capable of getting great performances, he's capable of seeing greatness, he's capable of making wonderful things that make you happy, but also, he's not fully capable of editing. So I'm going to sort of talk about that in this review. How does it all play out? I think ultimately, this is a great Beatles documentary, and to a lesser extent, it is kind of a bad Peter Jackson movie. He definitely doesn't quite nail it in terms of the editing. There were several moments where my family and I were in physical pain. Comment, smash the like bucket, subscribe, and put in the comments, did you also feel that at points? Like there were times where we were in physical pain because we wanted to keep watching. We loved the music, we loved the atmosphere, we loved everything so much. And then we'd hit pause and we'd see there's another 40 minutes and we're just like, oh, come on. You're making me hate the Beatles. I'm going to get more into that in detail. But what I want to do is sort of share with you what have I learned about the Beatles, what have I learned about their music, what have I learned about this album, what have I learned about the late stage of the Beatles. Really, this is just a wonderful document. And it was funny because early on, I watched it with my daughter and my wife. My daughter said, if they could just put on all 60 hours, and that'd be totally fine. And I think to a certain extent, that is how it feels. It does feel like he basically left everything in here. And we watch so much progress across time. It begins with a kind of awkward summary of Beatlemania and how they all got together with sort of odd emphasis at certain points, which then comes back. Like they spent a lot of time on the incident in Manila, which then later comes back in a further reference. They did have a terrible anachronism of showing the Yellow Submarine movie during the 1966 montage. That movie wouldn't come out for another couple of years. But in general, it does that very quickly. It spends very little time. If you are not a Beatles fanatic, I'm not sure how enjoyable this movie is. No, I know how enjoyable it is because my daughter she loves the Beatles, but she's not a fanatic. She still enjoyed it quite a bit. I did have to pause it, I did have to explain things, I did have to say, this was on that album, that's on that album, and they're talking about this person, and that person is this person, and that's the first wife, and that's the second wife. Okay. But what did I learn? Well, first of all, let's go through all 4 hobbits. Okay, let's go through the 4 hobbits and discuss their personalities, things I either learned or understood better by watching this. Paul. Paul really does come across as the absolute center of the band. He does come across as a manager under stress. Viewers of my channel know that I love the Smiths, and it's fascinating that the Smiths only lasted 4 years or 5 years, whatever, very little amount of time. And it's because they didn't have a manager. Johnny Marr basically had to be the manager. And I think if we could really see what happened with this band, a lot of it was that Paul sort of had to step up and be the manager. And we see him throughout this video being a reluctant tyrant. Like, never being mean, never being belittling, but just that kind of unbendable certainty on how to do things. It's fun seeing him with his old Hofner bass, and he had added a new sticker on it from the Twickenham studio. So, you know, when you see the movie, there's two locations really. There's the Savile Row studio, which they move into, and they start off in this big, gigantic, cavernous film studio in Twickenham. And he just takes this bassman sticker and puts it on the bass. And that bass is such an object of myth. It has the 1966 set list taped on it. It still has it taped on it. If you go and see Paul McCartney now, he plays that same bass. What happened to the bassman sticker? When did he take that off? Are you a Beatle fanatic out there watching this video? Could you please tell me that? So that's what I learned about Paul. What did I learn about John? So the thing about John is, for the last maybe decade or so, you know, I love the Beatles, but I've always had a sort of a frank assessment of who John Lennon was, and it wasn't very positive. Sort of a wife-leaving, child-abandoning, selfish, greedy, sort of fractured, gentle genius jerk. This movie really helped flesh it out a little bit more to understand him better, because just learning what a goofball he is, just constantly goofing, to the point where like I felt like Paul's restraint at trying to get this project off the ground and never getting mad at John was kind of a miracle, because John just would never stop. He would never stop goofing. He was always on, always pretending, always performing. All those little interludes that you hear on the Let It Be album, like, those were all improvised by John at the time, but it's because he could never stop goofing around. He could never stop goofing around, and he could never stop playing old rock and roll songs. This video, this documentary, helped me to understand that the project that he would do with Phil Spector, maybe 4 or 5 years after this, Rock and Roll, his album of rock and roll standards, came about because he was always in this mode. John Lennon comes across as a painfully nostalgic figure who's always trying to shoehorn in old rock and roll classics. Sometimes charming, usually just kind of distracting and annoying. The main thing I would cut out if I were Peter Jackson is the countless bad blues jams. Because the Beatles are an amazing band, and when they come together and they work together, it's great. But no band, I don't care who they are, is free of the absolute boredom of a lazy blues jam, a lazy 1-4-5 blues jam. I don't care who's playing it. It could be Jimi Hendrix playing with Keith Moon and Mozart. And if they're doing a blues jam, I am hitting skip on that track. A little too much of that throughout here. Then George up there, so deeply unhappy. It's the most painful part of this whole documentary, this whole 9 hours thing, is just seeing how sad he is. I mean, he praises Eric Clapton for like 15 minutes. You just want to take him and be like, dude, you're so much better than Eric Clapton. You know, he leaves the band, obviously, a little bit through, and says, see you around the club, and like, he can't quite come back. And he talks later about recording his own music, and it's clear he has so much, and everyone's sort of supporting him, and everyone's sort of not supporting him. It's funny because he's barely even in the documentary, except for his clothing. Secretly, he's the goofiest dresser of them all. I always thought it was John. This dude gets attacked by his psychedelic wardrobe every morning. But it really, you do feel, perhaps by the absence of a speech. I mean, when he does speak, he'll just sort of say things like, I'll do it, you want it, I don't care. You know, he'll just sort of say things, lots of bad Liverpudlian accents coming from Professor Skye, watch out. He's just so unhappy and so distant, and he just seems resigned. And that's one thing I didn't quite know, was how cognizant the Beatles were that this was the end. That they were conceiving of this movie or TV show or album or performance. They conceived of this thing that they didn't even understand what they conceived of it as. It's very funny. That House of Gucci movie, I think the only good thing about the House of Gucci movie is that none of the protagonists have, well, first of all the protagonists are antagonists, I like that, but none of them have a clear idea of what they want. That is the fascinating nature of this whole Get Back movie and the whole Let It Be album and the concert performance. No one knows what they want, but you definitely understand that whatever it is, it's over. Like, they know it, they feel it. And it feels over, certainly not because of Yoko, and not because of John or Paul. It really feels like it's over because of George. That leaves us with Ringo. Wonderful Ringo. What I learned, why did I say that like Trump? Oh, we love Ringo. Wonderful Ringo. We all love Ringo. Don't we love Ringo? We love Ringo. So the thing that I learned about Ringo is his true genius. Not just as a drummer. Again, other people have said better than I can say what a great drummer Ringo is. He is an astoundingly good drummer who plays well, knows how to write drum beats, knows when to play, when not to play, all the way through. I love how he had these dish towels over his snare the entire movie. Makes me want to try to track down that brand of dish towel and put it over my snare downstairs. What does Ringo do better than any other drummer has ever done in the history of humanity? I'll give you a second to think about it. I'll sip my coffee while you're thinking. Ringo shuts up. When John and Paul and George are constructing a song, Ringo is a statue. He just sits there with his mustache, and I hope it's not just because he's drunk. I don't think that's it. Just sits there and waits. Every other drummer in the history of humanity cannot stop playing drums for more than 15 seconds. One drummer once waited 16 seconds before playing a little ditty on the ride, but then, he couldn't go more than 15 seconds. Ringo will just sit there and not do anything and not interrupt. It made me understand, how did the Beatles make so much great music collaboratively for so long? Well, if you don't have a drummer who's and I know, I used to be a drummer. I wouldn't even let my guys tune. I was just so anxious and so antsy. So that is, I would say, Ringo's greatest skill is the peace, the quiet, to allow the rest of the Beatles to perform. Also, he farted. And that was a very nice moment. If I were Peter Jackson, I would have just cut that into the movie at different points because he farts and just says, I farted. What about the secondary characters? Well, we have Billy Preston, who comes across as the great hero of the album Let It Be, which indeed he was. It's fascinating because you see George talk him up early, and then eventually he comes in and he saves the whole project because the entire band is performing for him. He's their audience because they hold him in high esteem, because he's an outsider. They can't fight. Last year for COVID, I bought this on DVD, the Beatles Anthology. You can't find it streaming. I suggest you buy it. This cost me like $30, Beatles Anthology. If you haven't seen this, watch this before you watch Get Back. But even Paul was mentioning that this new blood gave them something to perform for. And it was just an amazing moment seeing them do that. He's constantly smiling, and when you hear him play, you realize he is the backbone of that album. He's the backbone of Let It Be, even though he came in all the way through. He's able to put up with the weird fascination that John Lennon has with the I Have a Dream speech. There is a lot of, I'm not the person to do it, but there would be a very great study of race and the Beatles in this movie. How clearly part of the reason they're performing for him is he's an African American who is a part of the culture that created all the music that they're making. There's at some point Paul says, what do we know about soul? We're just Northerners from Northern England. There's an interesting race thing here. I'm not going to say racism. I don't think that's the question, but there is an interesting race dynamic here. Other secondary characters include the ghost of Brian Epstein. At some point, Paul says we need a centralizing daddy figure, and that's especially poignant coming from Paul, who is forced into that role. There's also the ghost of George Martin, who's alive. He's alive and he's in this movie. He maybe makes one note. Along with the ghost of George Martin, is the rising phoenix of Glyn Johns. If you do not own this book, Sound Man by Glyn Johns, you are missing out on one of the best rock and roll autobiographies you could possibly have. Okay, amazing, amazing book. He talks a lot about the recording of Let It Be as well. We had this fascinating thing where, because Let It Be would end up being a live performed album, all the things that George Martin is so good at, the studio wizardry, the orchestrations, all that, just off to the side. So instead they need someone who's more in tune with live production and live recording. So Glyn Johns is a huge, huge benefit. And really, I mean, he has like a whole chapter all about recording Let It Be. There's so much great stuff in here. He even basically takes credit for the idea of recording the album without overdubs. That was basically his idea. I don't really know if that's true. Along with this beautiful, wonderful, majestic, heroic Glyn Johns, we have the interfering goblin on the wing, which is this guy named Magic Alex. And Glyn Johns really goes into him on this book. He calls him a fraud. This guy who George somehow brought in, he's just a very typical kind of hippie hanger-on who like comes up with all this like inventions and tries to set up the studio at Savile Row in the West End, and it's just like nothing works. He's just a total fraud. Like, you need to bring Glyn Johns to come in and fix it. One of my favorite moments is they're all making fun of Magic Alex. Everyone's making fun, and George is just sitting there stone-faced because that was his guy. Yoko is a secondary character, and I defend Yoko Ono always. If you're the kind of person who makes Yoko Ono jokes, allow me to help you. Stop. It's not good. You don't mean to, but you are participating in a sexist and a racist trope that has been going on for 50 years. You don't have to like her singing. You don't have to like her art. But the jokes, I'm just telling you now, okay? So within the next 5 years, there's going to be a biopic of Yoko Ono, I'm sure, and everyone's going to come around, and she's going to finally get the credit that she deserves as a great artist, as an amazing figure of the 20th century. But the thing that I didn't expect was how well-loved she was. Paul defends her constantly. When she starts singing, Paul is having fun and playing. In a way, when George leaves and Yoko starts singing, her yells are like the screams from the band, this pain. She just livens everything up. She's really, really, I think, a great figure. Of course, it's odd always having her there, always kind of staring, always there. Also, there's the moment where her divorce goes through and they're all happy. That's actually a very sad moment if you know the history of Yoko's life. She's never seen her child from her first divorce since that moment, like ever, like hidden from, can't find. So it's actually a sad moment. Linda Eastman is there as well, Paul's wife. And her daughter shows up quite a bit, and that's pretty fun because the band ends up performing for her in the same way they performed for Billy Preston, like just some outsider they want to perform for, even if it's a kid. You get to see Linda's photographs integrated into the documentary. This is one of Peter Jackson's great accomplishments, is lining up the photos, of seeing her take the pictures and then seeing the pictures themselves. It's just great. Patty Harrison Clapton and Maureen make quick appearances, but not too much. Then there's Mal, another great secondary character. He's the Judah Friedlander of the Beatles. He looks like him, talks like him. He's like a Swiss Army knife. He takes notes, he writes down lyrics, he keeps track of the script. He ends up running interference for the cops. But of course, the biggest hero of the entire movie, without question, is the director? No. Lindsay Hogg. As he said, "I thought I would leave, but no one would notice." He's barely in the movie. He didn't have enough gravitas to really pull off this whole project. The greatest hero is the person who my daughter calls Kevin the intern. Now, he was actually a roadie, but she kept calling him an intern. And he has red hair, so he stands out, and he's constantly, if there isn't already, there will be a cult of Kevin the roadie in the future. I want t-shirts, I want interviews, I want a biopic, I want everything about Kevin the roadie. He's constantly bringing tea, he's constantly bringing sandwiches, he's fixing things around, he's always being called in, his little red head flying all over the place until his true moment of glory. The version of I Dig a Pony that is on Let It Be, the actual recorded version that we all know and have loved for 50 years, 51 years. was the lyrics were being held up by the human music stand of Kevin the Roadie, the true hero of the movie. He is absolutely just wonderful. So another one of the big themes of the movie is the problem of the show itself. What are they going to do? Their inability to decide what are they going to make. At some point they reference Kubrick, which I thought was interesting, like making big plastic boxes, going to Libya. What's funny about this is that you know that had the Beatles done any of these other things, those places would... So if they'd actually gone to Sabratha in Libya, that would be a tourist destination where we'd all go and see where the Beatles performed. But they didn't want to go because if you watch this, you know Ringo does not want to go anywhere where he has to eat anything other than beans. He just doesn't like it, you know. And they have, the thing about playing on the greens, that would be a tourist destination. It's just fascinating to think about how like they don't really know what they're doing. They don't really have any decisions. And every decision that they sort of could have come up with creates like an alternate reality where that becomes the first place I would visit in England, right? If they had played in the green, there's some green where they almost played, that would have been the first place I would go in London. One of the weirdest things about this, and I sort of got this sense from watching the documentary, and I've gotten the sense from like watching documentaries about the Rolling Stones. You think that these bands are just rolling in money and that the record companies are just dishing them out money and making sure they're comfortable and happy. The Beatles in 1969 can't get like microphones or amplifiers or a recording studio. They have to like borrow George Harrison's studio and bring it in. Everything is so skinflint. Like nothing's like warm enough. Like nothing like makes sense. There's no support. It's insane. Like the biggest band in the world. And seriously, like I think if Smash Mouth recorded an album, their record company would take better care of them now than the Beatles were taken care of by EMI. They're just constantly scraping by, trying to find the right microphones, trying to find the right chords, hoping that something works. It's just, it's amazing, especially considering the hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue that EMI has gotten just from Let It Be. You know, just the amount of revenue that has been generated by these four dudes and their helpers sitting around in a room when EMI was barely lifting a finger to help them out. So what are some of the ways that it's bad, this movie? It really is just sometimes there was just too much left in. There's a point where Peter Sellers comes in and meets the Beatles. Peter Sellers, one of the great comedic minds of the 20th century. The Beatles, the greatest rock and roll band there ever was. They get together, and it is nothing. No charisma, no jokes, no stories, just sitting around in a circle and talking. Hey, Peter Jackson, cut it out. I'm sorry, it's not interesting. It sounds interesting, but it's not. The licensing director shows up to talk about the sheet music being distributed in America. It's like a 25-minute conversation, which I barely understand. My wife and my daughter had zero comprehension of what was going on. Hey, cut it out. At a certain point, I started to think, maybe this is genius. Maybe. He was genius for Lord of the Rings. Because what is Lord of the Rings if not a very, very, very slow and engaging book about people walking somewhere and throwing a ring into a lake? What is this whole process if not studio drudgery, fatigue, anxiety? Like, you really did feel at a certain point while watching this, like, God, I sort of wish this would just stop. Can they go to lunch now? Can we have a break? You know, we would take breaks. You know, we'd wait till a day was over because the movie is well divided into days because it's like 22 days. So we'd take, a break. So after day 3, we'd get up and go have pumpkin pie and then come back, But you just wanted these days to end. And maybe that is a reflection of the process. Maybe that's the idea they were trying to get at. I will say that because you hear so much that isn't the actual studio version, if you're like me, and when I was in high school, Let It Be was my favorite Beatles album. Even with all the Phil Spector, as Glynn John calls it, all the Phil Spector vomit all over it, I love that album. I know every single note. So like I would hear versions of the song, and I'd hear like in the third line of the first verse is delivered a little bit. It's like, oh, that's not the real version. They'll play you the real version, and at a certain point it comes up, this is the version that's on Let It Be. And it's like, you just, oh, that is so nice. It's so cool seeing them play the actual version of the song that I've known and loved for so long. Also, something I didn't realize until seeing this, Spinal Tap, I think was mostly based on this. Not just the director, Lindsay Hogg, and the owner of the record company for Spinal Tap is Sir Dennis Eaton Hogg, but also a lot of the throwback, like the throwback to the songs they sang before the band started in the early days, and Squatney. There's the dynamics between the band. I was really surprised, but I think this is essential viewing for Spinal Tap fans. So let's get to the music. Let's get to the performances. It's all leading up to the rooftop, and I'm not really going to talk about the rooftop. It's fun. It's surprising how much of the stuff that was played on the rooftop made it on. It was totally necessary for the narrative flow of the movie. It's very exciting. I explained to my daughter, this is like the Titanic. Like, you know that Titanic is going to sink. You know the Beatles are going to end up on the roof. But how does the boat sink? How do they end up on the roof? How do they get there? They almost did a cruise line to Libya, and instead they ended up on the roof of the building they were currently sitting in, you know? That's exciting seeing it get there. How likable and bizarre the Bobbies are, the cops are. You know, it's all fine. But if you've already seen the original Let It Be movie from '70, you've basically seen all of this. So it's really the studio stuff that interests me the most. The thing I found most heartening is how well they know each other's music. You'll see John sing a Paul song and Paul sing a John song. I mean, John singing Maxwell's Silver Hammer, it's like it's like this weird, uncanny thing of just people just singing these songs and singing each other's parts. And like they work so hard. And I talk about how John's a big goofball, but no one works hard. John is like working so hard all the way through, and they're constantly working on it. You know, like there's this shorthand. Why don't I get into I'm going to go into all the songs, not all the songs. Most of the songs I took notes as they went through the entire 9 hours and how they developed. Obviously, the best song on Let It Be isn't even on Let It Be. It's a B-side, Don't Let Me Down. I said recently it is an example of a perfect song, and it is a perfect song. But when you see them start to write the song, you see this miraculous shorthand. Just like talking to each other and like briefly mentioning like, oh, it's the C part to the B, but you can't go down to the A. And like they just have these conversations and they know exactly what they're saying. Glynn Johns is actually asked how things should go, and he does. Like he actually says it, and you see him on there. And that's pretty fun because in this in this video, in this book, let's see. In the first hour of rehearsals, being asked for my input into the arrangement, I responded quickly and confidently as I could and suggested a way of playing the intro, which they liked, and we were off. I was amazed at how quickly and how easily I was accepted, each guy individually making an attempt to put me at ease, make me feel part of the team. I was only then to understand that George Martin was not to be involved. Great book. Seriously great book. I also love how George hates on Don't Let Me Down, calling it corny over and over again. If you've never seen Some Kind of Monster, this is a lot like Lars Ulrich saying, it's stock. It's really stock. What can I say? It's stock. It's corny. Get Back, the titular song, is the song you hear the most. And what I love is the first time you see it being played, George is yawning. Ringo seems bored. One thing about the lyrics I didn't understand, you know, the lyrics to Get Back are so fascinating. What this documentary taught me was how serious the Beatles were with their nonsense lyrics. Because, you know, after the psychedelic age, a lot of the lyrics sort of lost meaning, lost cohesion. They're just sort of talking and just putting words together. But they're like working on these names, JoJo and Loretta, and like, what's the last name? Is Loretta White? Is Loretta Marsh? Like all these, like emphasizing, like it's very serious business, this sound. And this is gonna sound crazy, but this actually reminds me of a lot of modern hip hop, what I call the Ghostface Killah school of hip hop, which like, it's not that the words matter in themselves, but it's that the sounds of the words together are important, and it creates this agreeable almost instrumentation of voice. And that's what we get with all these nonsense lyrics throughout this entire album, that they're all chosen very, very carefully. You'll see them like rewriting and cross it out, like I Dig a Pony, all those lyrics are so ridiculous, but you see how carefully John is thinking about it and how he's writing them. It turns out Get Back was originally going to be like a pro-immigration song. And like John and Paul are like collaborating and just very Lennon-McCartney collaborating and talking about the Commonwealth and too wealthy for me and too common for me and taking shots at Enoch Powell, I suppose the PM of England at the time. And it's just great watching them work through the song, seeing Paul, while waiting for someone to show up, write the song, and you see him make it. Like you see the whole song from its very beginning to its fully polished, to seeing them actually recording the actual version that it goes. And all the way throughout, all this shorthand. Paul basically just grunts his way through describing how the song's going to work. And then you see John's solo. And John never plays the solo. First of all, did you know it was John playing the solo on Get Back? I didn't know that. You see his solo is so memorized, he plays it exactly the same every single time. And that gives you an idea that the lyrical solo is lyrical on purpose. It's a crafted solo. Billy Preston on Get Back and on Don't Let Me Down pulls the songs together. I mean, think about Don't Let Me Down without those organs. And same thing with the solos in Get Back. He just brings so much to this album. One After 909 is a very interesting song. That's one of those early songs they wrote in Liverpool, back in Squatney. And this is the side of this album that's very nostalgic, especially John. Nostalgic for the old days. They're constantly talking about Hamburg, they're talking about Cavern, they're talking about all this. And just One After 909 is the winner. But we hear all these other super early songs, like pre-Beatles songs by Lennon and McCartney, in addition to all these old rock and roll songs, Blue Suede Shoes. I did love hearing John Lennon singing Hank Williams's You Win Again. I didn't know that John knew anything about Hank Williams. That's quite nice. One of the surprising things to me was how many Abbey Road songs were on here. So when I was a kid, I knew the Beatles albums in order. I didn't know they recorded Let It Be before Abbey Road. And it turns out it doesn't really matter. They just, 1969, basically any other band would have had a double album from 1969 and would have Let It Be and Abbey Road. They're just all part of the same thing. Just one's published, one's very well produced and polished, and the other is live and a little bit raw. So it's so much fun watching Maxwell Silver Hammer being played and written with Mal playing the anvil, Carry the Weight. Paul explains what the weight is. Did you know this? The weight that you're carrying and Carry the Weight, it's your head. You're gonna have to carry that. My neck always hurts because I got what I call the panium cranium. I got a big head. So my neck always hurts from having to carry this weight. I'm gonna carry this weight a long time. You get to see Ringo literally writing Octopus's Garden, right there, and George coming over and helping him, and it's so sweet. It's like the excitement and the sweetness that you get watching the Beatles goof around in a hotel room in 1964. That feeling of watching that footage and just seeing them be friends and just love, just the love that they had for each other. Whenever it was around Ringo or around Billy Preston, we could see this love and this kindness. I think it's because they represented simpler figures in the band, right? There wasn't that much question. There wasn't really vying for control. They were just players, even Ringo. But it's just so charming seeing them all help out. Watching writing Something in the Way, which would be on Abbey Road, watching George write that, and then John giving him instructions, moves me and then the original lyrics were moth to a candle. But John just says, just keep throwing things in until something works. And that's going, again, the seriousness of their nonsense music. We get to see a version of I Want You, which is done with the I Have a Dream speech. The inverse of all these songs that we see that are Abbey Road and make you super excited are all the songs which are actually solo tracks. So we see them do All Things Must Pass, which would be a George solo track. We see Give Me Some Truth, which would be a John solo track. We see a couple of Paul solo tracks as well. If you know the Beatles as well as many people do, it's crazy to see this document of them pulling apart while still staying together. It's so much of what's great about them and still together, while also all the signs are there. I got so pissed at Peter Jackson for allowing George Harrison to bore us with what he saw on TV last night about some science fiction movie. It just goes on and on and on and on and on. Peter Jackson, what are you doing? How many times do we have to end this damn movie? How many times are those hobbits gonna hug? And then he talks about the next thing that he saw, which had some people waltzing, which got him writing a waltz, which ends up being the song I Me Mine. Damn it, Peter Jackson, you got me again. It was all worth it. Because you see that I Me Mine, beautiful song, one of my favorite songs, very underrated song, also the title of George Harrison's autobiography, which I could have bought for $900 in 1994, and I didn't buy it because I didn't have any money, but I should have figured out a way to get money, because that would have been a great deal. Anyways, I mean, autographed autobiography of George Harrison. Anyways, so he's like telling these random stories, and then it turns into I Me Mine, and then they play it. It's beautiful. Later on, he does For You Blue, and it's funny because he said it's basically a one-take wonder, and then they play it, and it's a one-take wonder. Much like George Harrison throughout his entire Beatles career, his appearances are brief, are memorable, and are mostly pushed to the side. Like For You Blue is another great song. John is playing the lap guitar. I didn't know he was the one playing that on the album. I didn't know how much like lead stuff John actually did on Let It Be or ever. But both these songs that are on Let It Be are just great and just kind of pushed aside. And it makes sense why George is at some point talking about doing a solo album to John and Yoko, and they're both like, yeah, you should do it. Across the Universe comes in mostly finished. My favorite thing is that John is so relentless about his joking, so relentlessly irreverent of everything, that here we are, the first time the Beatles are hearing Across the Universe, this song which, frankly, can make anybody cry if they have a heart, you know? Across the Universe is just a heartbreaking, beautiful song. Nothing's gonna change my world. The first time it says, John jumps in and says, I wish it effing would. Like even that, even his own songs, he steps on. Long and Winding Road makes long and many, many appearances all the way throughout. I am famous for my dislike of this song. However, the Dr. and Mrs., my wife, loves this song. So hey, she does have a good point. His voice is beautiful. It is beautiful. I think I just had too much experience with the Phil Spector version of it, which is, I think, unlistenable. The one thing that Peter Jackson did that was really a bad idea is he included the finished version of Long and Windy Road. So you saw it and you're like, oh, sweet. And the thing is, we have a contract going, Peter, where you show us building up to the song and then you show us the final version of it, and then we don't have to worry about it again. But then like 5 minutes later, there's more Long and Winding Road. It's like, dude, it's over. The song's over. It's in the books. We don't need to hear it again. Two of Us is an interesting song. The idea of it not having bass, which I hadn't really even thought of. They do a version of it where they sing through gritted teeth, and thankfully Peter Jackson does not cut this out. It is very weird. Seeing John Lennon sing like this to us, that they'll just joke about anything and all the time. They just keep joking and they do it, and they appear to be in some kind of staring match with each other, and you just keep singing like this. And actually I kind of understand it, because it's sort of fun to talk like this. I'm like Detective Lockjaw. I've Got a Feeling is one of the standouts on the album, and here, because the collaborative nature, any song that has so much pass-off between John and Paul is just great. At one point they even practiced it without Paul. This and Don't Let Me Down are the big winners as far as the songs and seeing them constructed, because every time you see him say I Got a Feeling, when you see him do it up on the roof, the version that will be on Let It Be, you just get this connection. And you know, when Paul's singing one thing and John's singing the other, just the joy. There's just so much joy in this album, and I understand that that's the point of the entire thing, is to show the joy of the Beatles, that it wasn't all just anger. That the gritted teeth were out of anger, but the gritted teeth are also out of joy, because they're goofing around. They ultimately do show the final recording of The Two of Us, and what's amazing is, after the roof performance, they had one more day of recording with beautiful setups. Like, it was filmed much more concretely, like a performance, and it's beautiful seeing it. And then that brings us to Let It Be, which is the song that had to end it, obviously. Get Back sort of always has to, like the story of the Beatles outside of Abbey Road, sort of always has to be starting with Get Back, ending with Let It Be. You see Paul fudging his way through the lyrics, like shooting lyrics out while Judah Friedlander writes them down, while Mal writes them out, you know? Arguments with George about the chords. George calls one of the chords passé, and Paul says it's not passé, it's a chord. And the amazing thing, and this is probably my favorite thing in the entire documentary, and it's at the very, very end. The final version of Let It Be, the famous version that you have heard 1,000 times. When it's being played, John Lennon is lip syncing for goofs while Paul's singing it. The whole time. And here we have the whole project, the whole documentary in a nutshell. This beautiful song, this aching tribute to the nature of this ephemeral band that existed and then left, this magical alchemy of these four geniuses all coming together and making music for the short period of time, and they're making it. And meanwhile that we're feeling all the depths of this, we're also laughing because John is goofing around. It's absolutely awesome to have that as the actual version. So what did you think of it? That's what's called a call to action. What did you think of the Beatles documentary? Did you find it? Is it just me that it got boring? Is the boringness intentional? I don't know. Here's all my Patreons, updated list. I think I took out the people who left and I added the people who joined. If you don't know, if you give me money on Patreon, I take that money and I just buy music with it. I just support artists. I wouldn't buy the Beatles music with your money though. If I buy Beatles stuff, that's my money. They don't need your money. But like, up and coming artists or newer artists or artists who aren't billionaires. I will say the saddest point of the entire movie is at one point, Paul just says, and then there were two, and it's him and Ringo because John and George aren't there yet. And you could tell that Paul and Ringo are sort of crying. And it feels like they know, like the Beatles are over and that's where they're crying. But of course now, in 2021, there are only two Beatles left. And it's sad, because neither of them should have died. Oof, I did that on a bummer. Anyways, once again, reading recommendation, Glynn Johns, Soundman, his stuff with Led Zeppelin, The Who, it's really great. Watching recommendation, spend the money on Beatles Anthology. And movie recommendation, don't see House of Gucci, do see Spencer. Okay, until next time, we'll actually talk about some music. Hopefully, I get to listen to music again. There's the camera.